external aid might actually be bad for economic development. That leaves the responsibility in the hands of people of Orania to make 100% sure.
But Orania was not yet satisfied.
We cannot think of that as just an experiment. Reducing a people, a nation, a folk, is to take a lot away from what they are.
A Swedish researcher spent almost 2 months living in Orania trying to ask one simple question. How can an Afrikaner community try to be self-reliant in an area or a continent which it seems that most of its funding or donations comes from the West? So he visited Orania for this research specifically. Today I am in the studio with Joost, CEO of the Orania Movement, going through Rasmus's findings and trying to answer some of these questions as well.
Frans, thank you. It's a great opportunity to share an outside perspective on Orania, specifically an academic perspective. It's some groundbreaking new research. Not that for us the strategies are groundbreaking, because it's what we've been doing, but getting it published, I think, is a breakthrough for Orania. And Rasmus Gunnery publishing these sets of research on Orania, speaking to people here, living for, as you said, almost 2 months in the community, becoming an integral part of, or viewing every integral part of the community's day-to-day life. I think it's very good. And thank you for everyone tuning in. It's going to be great to share the results directly from Rasmus's studies and share with our viewers an outside perspective on our community.
Now here's the main 3 questions that Rasmus had, the main 3 things that his study was conducted about. How did Orania come to exist and why? How is urban planning conducted in Orania, and what strategies in relation to urban planning has Orania adopted to become a more sustainable and self-reliant city? Now, the most significant finding, or the most significant conclusion to Rasmus's study, was that even though the Afrikaner community of Orania does not receive any sort of outside funding in terms of government funding, they still seem to be more reliant or self-reliant by the day. Now, yes, do you agree with this finding of him?
I do agree, and the interesting thing for me was in the start of his thesis, the author specifically stated that Orania is in a context of a larger Africa. Orania is in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, and he makes the kind of the observation that outside aid can sometimes be a negative thing. He refers to sub-Saharan Africa as the poorest region in the world. That's in terms of GDP and economic growth opportunities and so on. And he also, as you mentioned, refers to the heavily subsidized institutions in Africa. Aid from the West, aid from the United States and so on. And at the same time, the urban development, because Rasmus's studies refers to urban development and city planning very specifically. So he sets the context of sub-Saharan Africa, and then he says, in this, external aid might actually be bad for economic development. External aid might actually compete with individuals trying to set up businesses. If you, for example, trying to set up a business selling jackets and people are constantly donating jackets, yes, people will be warm through the winter, but economic growth is stagnating in the jacket industry. And he refers to this in his abstract. I'm obviously paraphrasing a bit now. But it's a very important context to share. What if the key to economic growth, as the people of Orania identify it, is precisely not having outside support from large Western countries giving loads of money.
Another very important context to know about is the context of the physical environment of Africa, of South Africa, and then especially the physical environment of Orania as well. Now, the study refers to Orania being situated in a sparsely low-populated semi-desert area, and it also refers to the Orania founders specifically choosing this semi-desert area to establish Orania. Very interestingly, though, the researcher shows that this is more opportunistic than detrimental to the success of the town. Do you agree with this, and how would he come to that conclusion?
I think Frans, he very specifically came to the conclusion, and maybe it's a good opportunity for our viewers to also chime in. By the way, if you haven't subscribed yet to our channel, do subscribe. You can receive all the newest updates on Orania and initiatives like these research paper that we're discussing now. But also, click that bell and you get notifications, just very important. But back to your question, Frans, I do think it's important for our viewers to also share their perspectives on Orania's location. We did an article about that fairly recently when we stated why is Orania specifically located where it is located. So he refers to this obviously in the part of his project background, saying that Orania is next to the Orange River, but it's in a almost isolated part of the country, not by accident, but because of planning. And he specifically refers to the fact that Afrikaners trying to be self-sufficient and self-reliant and further the cause of freedom needs to be a majority in a certain area. Obviously, he is referring to the interviews that he had and the reactions that he have gotten for the reason of Orania's location specifically. And if you look at Orania on a map, you can very clearly see that it's a carefully selected area, undeveloped, but with the potential of development, and demographically empty, with the potential of being filled by Afrikaners.
Now, this research is done, it's urban planning research, and Orania is urban development. And the researcher talks about the different strategies that Orania uses to further this urban development. But also, it refers very specifically to the three main Orania principles, being own labor, own land, and own institutions. Now, the researcher finds that these are not just principles or ideals, but they can actually be tools to further self-reliance in your urban development in your community, such as Orania. So how do some of these tools, or how are some of these tools used in Orania, and what are some of the strategies that the researcher has found?
Yes, well, something that you can clearly see in his research is he very carefully studied Orania's policy documents, which is the Orania Town Council's urban development framework, among others, as well as our external contractors that we use we have professional city planners coming in and studying and advising on city planning policy. In our urban development planning, then, there are references to our regulatory documents, our long-term development plan, and so on and so on. And he says in this, its purpose is to envision a clear strategy for future growth and self-governance while ensuring that development is sustainable, organized, and aligns with laws and planning principles. Meaning that the Orania plan, the Orania development plan, is not in a vacuum of what we want, let's say, politically. It's very much on a professional level aligned with what is necessary to develop a city, to stay in line with proper regulations of such development, such as zoning and so on. He refers to that. He do also refer to the urban design framework and more. So that's very important. Then you mentioned something else, Frans. You mentioned that the author, the researcher, didn't only look at urban planning, he also looked at the strategies for growth, creating a foundation. And he specifically referenced development institutions in Orania. He asked, how do the community of Orania focus on things like creating institutions where not only contract work will be done, but also bottlenecks will be broken open through coordination and developing, and so on and so forth. Specifically also referencing the Orania Development Company. The second strategy, I think you also mentioned this later, but energy. Energy independence is something that this researcher identified as not a fulfilled, done task by Orania's institutions, but something that is very much highlighted for two reasons. The first is just energy independence in a country where energy stability is an issue, but also because cheap energy is extremely important in development. And then he refers that this is funded from institutions and private investors in Orania. Now, coming back to the abstract where he mentioned that Sub-Saharan Africa's development might be hindered by constant aid from the West, he here specifically mentions private institutions or institutions and private investors investing in Orania economically. And there's a massive, massive difference, Frans, between receiving aid free of not necessarily free of any responsibility, but receiving aid for the sake of being aid versus investing for the purpose of getting an ROI, getting that return on investment. That leaves the responsibility in the hands of people of Orania to make 100% sure that the solar project or whichever development project is a success. Otherwise, you can't pay your investors, and then you're in big trouble.
Yes, let's talk about solar and development. South Africa has this situation where electricity can become very expensive and at sometimes not even available. And Orania, through its own self-reliant or self-sufficiency solar farm project, has been able to generate about 40% of its own electricity. Now, the researcher tells this story, and then I want to quote the research where he says, but Orania was not yet satisfied. Talking about maybe at some point exporting electricity. So how, within the context of being in South Africa, where electricity is a scarcity, within the context of being in Africa, where we have just spoken about aid, Africa receiving lots of aid, how can a community put its sights on exporting rather than receiving?
That's such an important question, Frans. There is no economic growth without exporting something. Without productivity, there is no economic growth. Without producing and selling something, you will stagnate economically. Doesn't matter, you can stand on your head, you can mine all you want. If you can't add value and export it successfully and sell it to someone, you will be in constant economic decline. You will use more than you create. And as I said, we mustn't look at Orania's strategy in terms of things like energy as a finished project. We're in baby shoes still. 50% of our energy is locally produced in terms of specifically electrical energy. But if we look at South Africa's energy crisis, and even if the lights are on, even if there's no load shedding, and for international viewers that is rolling blackouts, right? So even if there's no load shedding currently in the country, energy is expensive and becoming more and more and more so. You can look at that as a big big problem to survive economically. You can look at that as one of the big barriers to economic entry. Or you can look at that as an opportunity to make the correct plans, get the correct engineers together, get the correct investors, and start selling energy so that you not only supply energy to those who need it, but also build your own economy. That is economic growth, and I think that is what this researcher correctly identified as an important aspect of Orania's future plans.
The researcher also describes Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom's theory of a community being better managed when it's managed internally than through outside control. The researcher further argues that Orania might be the first practical example of this theory. Do you agree with this?
So it was a very interesting kind of angle to take, citing this research and saying that if you look at Orania's self-governance dream, not necessarily through a political lens, where you say, well, a people has the right to care for themselves and make their own decisions, but also from an economics perspective. Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for economics, and her argument was that in governing the commons, that people should look after themselves, and that is economically good for you. And that means we are, hitting two birds with one stone, hitting two flies with one slap, So, yes, we have a political goal of being more in charge of our own future, furthering our freedom. But economically, it's also good for Orania if the locals make decisions through the institutions that they create and build. And I think it's a pretty insightful thing to identify. That this is it's a blade which is sharp on two sides. You have a political goal, you have an economic goal, and the two merge into one another for a strategy for a people. So I do very much like that argument.
Yes, very interestingly, researchers tend to get their research from experiments. So in a certain sense, Orania becomes this social experiment, this political experiment, this economic experiment, even this cultural experiment. And that might be why so many people are drawn to Orania to do their research here, to see what are the social lessons that we can teach people. Reading through the researcher's study, reading through his conclusion, reading through his findings, do you agree with the crux, the main study that he has provided?
Frans is always a kind of almost a sensitive subject to me, because he rightly calls Orania an experiment. And in some ways it is. I mean, in some ways, Orania is an experiment of a new way of understanding ourselves as Afrikaners, a new way of managing the political landscape in South Africa, a new way of focusing on community and the health and psychological health and the general happiness of people, and also political relations. It's an experiment on many ways, and that is the reason why so many researchers are interested in Orania. But there's another aspect as well, and that is that the soil under our feet and where our children grow up and the schools they attend, we cannot think of that as just an experiment. It would be hurtful to call a people and their place only an experiment. I've said it in the United States as well. Many people speak about the American experiment or the Greek experiment of democracy or whatever. I mean, it's a political experiment in a certain sense, but reducing a people, a nation, a folk, to only an experiment is to take a lot away from what they are. We are not just an experiment. And that's not saying that this researcher in his studies call us just an experiment. But we are more than an experiment. He also calls us an example in the theory of self-governance. That is our goal. But we're also more than that. We are still a people. The town has managed to adopt to the arid Karoo landscape and use the limited resources available in a healthy way to reach a higher level of sustainability and self-reliance. Adopt to the land under our feet. Adopt to the arid conditions here. And that there's something deeper than just a lab with an experiment, in my opinion.
Just finally, we have been going through these findings very briefly, but at the end of the day, this is an academically researched document with academically researched findings. But for someone who has never visited Orania, if they would read through this study, do you think that they would better understand the strategy of Orania?
I do think so, and I do think so because the researcher went through a lot of trouble to speak with multiple individuals, giving them a voice, but an objective voice, because it's neither a promotional puff piece nor a media hit piece. Somewhere in between there is an academic truth. It's the opinions of people in regards to what we are doing and why, and it's the actualization of things like utilities, planning, electricity, sewage, and so on, and how these things work and connect to one another. In my opinion, a very good study. He also specifically mentions that further research is necessary. You cannot even understand Orania in just a scope of 2 months. It's a complicated, nuanced thing to approach and to understand, but in my opinion, definitely worth a read.
To sum up, this was a study on self-reliance, on urban planning, with as little as or no aid possible. A study done by a Swedish researcher in Orania. Joost, I say thank you.
Frans, thank you very much, and thank you for everyone tuning in. Remember to like, subscribe. It really helps our channel out a lot. It gives us the opportunity to spread the message of Orania even further.